I'm Clare Goldsberry, and I have just completed a book called The Illusion of Life and Death, Mind, Consciousness, and Eternal Being. This webinar is going to talk about living and dying fearlessly. And I'm hoping that you will work with me and consider what life is and what death is. I entered this world of science and theosophy and Buddhism a number of years before I met my significant other. This meeting of Brent gave me an opportunity to learn something that I didn't know before, and that is how to live fearlessly and how to die fearlessly. I think that Blavatsky's use of science and scientists in her writings actually prompted me to begin studying quantum science along with my study of Buddhism, and led me to realize that there was a parallel path between quantum physics and Buddhism. And what does this have to do with learning to live fearlessly and die fearlessly? Because once we understand life, we understand death. And when we understand how to die, we can live better. I actually did a 6-year study of Mahayana Buddhism at a local Buddhist Sangha. And along with my studies of quantum physics and theosophy, I did gain insights that I never dreamed I could ever obtain with respect to consciousness, reality, how quantum science has shined the light of knowledge on both of these spiritual traditions, theosophy and Buddhism. But I just begun this journey when I met my significant other, Brent, and he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer about 8 years after we met. That diagnosis threw me for a loop. When he received the diagnosis, he looked at me and he said, well, gee, this should be another excellent adventure. And I just was stunned. I had no idea what to think. I'd never known anybody who'd had cancer. I'd never known anybody who'd even been sick. Everybody in my family lived to be 100 years old. And so it really got me, and I didn't know what to think or what to do. But what the next 18 months gave me was experimental insights that really helped me understand fear and illness, the dying process and death, beyond just an intellectual way. You can read about death and dying, and there's a lot of books out there about death and dying, and you can read about it, but you've got that intellectual understanding, but do you really have a realization of what life is and what death is beyond that intellectual method, and a true realization? And also how fearlessness gives us freedom and joy in the face of all adverse events. And Brent was my teacher. The book, The Illusion of Life and Death, Mind, Consciousness, and Eternal Being, actually began as a journal that I kept for 18 months as Brent went through his cancer diagnosis and his subsequent death from esophageal cancer. What this experience did was teach me a lot about death and dying from a lot of standpoints, from the sages, from the ancient wisdom teachers, from especially the Eastern traditions such as Buddhism and Hinduism, philosophers all through the ages. Everyone has something to say about the death and dying process, because the one thing all human beings have in common, in fact, all living beings have in common, is that we will die. Human beings perhaps have a different outlook on death and dying. And I think this will help us maybe understand not just death and dying, but living, how to live and die fearlessly, and finding that path to living well and dying well. So what about embracing death? You know, you hear that we should embrace all as the path. Everything is the path. And we talk about embracing life, but what about embracing death? So we can look at some of the things that people have had to say about it in the past. Set before your eyes every day death and exile and everything else that looks terrible, especially death. Then you will never have any mean thought or be too keen on anything. And I think what he's trying to say here is that if you're always remembering death and other things that may happen, is you are remembering what is impermanent about life. And so if you always remember death, you won't have any mean thoughts about anything, not be involved with criticisms, judging, or be too keen on anything. Maybe you give up desires that you thought were the most important thing in your life. But if you set before your eyes every day death, then you remember death. And that should help us have a better life. It's not depressing to remember death. It should help us find our path to a better life and learn how to live better, live well. One time, Krishnamurti was asked what he thought about reincarnation. Did he believe in reincarnation, and what about life after death? And Krishnamurti responded, "You don't know anything about life. Why are you worried about death?" And that is probably true. When we think about life and death, people always say, well, I don't know a lot about death or dying or what happens after death, or will I be reincarnated? And yet we really don't know how to live our life. Because life and death are closely entwined. They're just two sides of the same coin. And I think we fall into this idea that, yeah, we know everybody says, yeah, I'm going to die. I know I'm going to die. Everybody says that. But does anybody really think about it, really believe it? And because life and death are closely intertwined, it's important that we understand both of those perspectives and understand them from a number of different ways. So embracing life. Now, we've talked about embracing death. What about embracing life? That's where we should be. But Krishnamurti also said, if one does not know what living is, one cannot know what death is. They go together. Again, they're two sides of the same coin. They're entwined. Because the minute we're born, we're on a path to dying. And so naturally, if you don't know what living is, how can you know what death is as well? And so I believe that to be fearless in death, we must first have a knowledge of life. To be fearless in life, we must gain an understanding of death. And we all think we know what life is. Well, it's living. I have a body and I live and I do all this stuff here in this material universe. But somehow we become fearful of death. I think death is the one thing that, well, all sentient beings have in common. Because even from the tiniest little ant, put your finger down in front of a little tiny ant and see what happens. That ant will run away from your finger. That ant has an instinct to preserve its life, to think, oh, something's after me. I have to run. And that instinct kind of remains with us, even as human beings. We don't want to die. And so we develop this fear of death that actually becomes an obstacle to our being able to live well. Aeneas Nen said, the fear of death is in proportion to not living. The less a person is in life, the greater the fear. People living deeply have no fear of death. Well, we have to learn to live deeply because it's in the depths that we find our greatest satisfactions, our greatest rewards. Living on the surface, I know a lot of people that just kind of live on the surface of life, and they don't really go deep within. They don't go down where the real meaning is. I was reminded of the story in the New Testament of Jesus and his disciples, and he was at the shoreline when they came back from fishing, and Jesus asked his disciples, well, did you catch anything? And they said, well, no, we went out, but we didn't catch anything. And Jesus told them, well, you didn't go out far enough. He said, launch out into the deep, go out into the depths. That's where you'll find all the fish. And they did. And sure enough, they had a great catch. And I've always been intrigued by that idea of launch out into the deep, because we all tend to kind of want to live on the shallows and not really look deeply at life and look deeply into ourselves and see what is really there. What truth do we have within ourselves? So life and death are one. And Khalil Gibran from the Prophet said, if you would indeed hold the spirit of death, open your heart wide unto the body of life. For life and death are one, even as the river and sea are one. In other words, one just flows into the other. And Diana X said, the great transition which death occasions is not from life to death, but life to life. And I think that's where we get stuck. We get stuck in this idea that we were born on a certain day and that we will die on a certain day. And we don't see it as a flow as much as we see it as a beginning and an ending. And yet there is no real beginning, as we'll see, and there is no real ending. It's not from life to death, but life to life, because we're always encountering life on different levels. So what about fear? I write a lot about fear in the book. And when you look at our current state of affairs, there's a lot of fear, people living in fear. And fear is really the enemy. I was listening to a Hindu Ayurvedic practitioner. It gave a Zoom meeting on fear and disease. And he even said that fear truly is the enemy. Fear will cause you to, it will cause you stress. It hurts your immune system. It gets your heart, it just stresses your whole body. So he recommends, don't be fearful. Surendra Narayan said, a state of fearlessness is a state of peace. Can you imagine your life with no fear? And that's sort of counterintuitive to our instincts, and we still carry over some of those animal instincts that we've had for thousands of years. This idea of fear, because fear is a protective emotion. It tells us to run if something's after us, just like it tells even the animals to avoid being caught and eaten. And so fear has a place, certainly. But when we become fearful of everything and fear of losing our body, that's kind of the biggest fear we have, because we're so identified with our bodies. Our bodies is who we are. I am my body. And of course, we have to learn that, no, I'm not my body, that there's more to me than just this. And, that's a good thing in a lot of ways. We see fear and desire as the primary drivers of life in samsara, which is also referred to as the desire realm in Buddhism. But fear and desire, and they drive us to not have the life we really are capable of living. We're either afraid or we're always after something more. We desire more of this or that and fear things that we don't want. And so we gain these attractions to things we do want and fear of the things we don't want. And so it really kind of drives our life, everything that we do. We fear death and we desire a life without pain and suffering. That's as the Buddha said, is not possible. As he said in the first noble truth, life is pain and suffering. And that's hard. That's a hard pill to swallow. It really is. So what causes this fear? Well, in Buddhism, there are 3 poisons. There's attachment, which is clinging to impermanent phenomena and relationships as if they were real and permanent. Attachment causes us a lot of suffering. In fact, it's been said that attachment is the root of suffering, because we tend to cling to things that are not permanent, with the mistaken idea that if we just get what we want, we're going to have it forever, and we don't. And so to cling to something that's impermanent, whether it's material possessions, whether it's relationships, whether it's our bodies, if we cling to these things as if they were real and permanent, we find ourselves getting stuck in this idea that we can always have the life exactly as we want it, without pain and suffering, and with everything we need to make us happy. And then there's the second poison, which is hatred or anger. And if you look at these 2 things carefully and really think about it, hatred and anger both arise from fear. I've had people tell me lately that they've never seen so many angry people. Everywhere they go, people seem to be angry. And I think that is a part of the fearfulness. People are afraid of disease. They're afraid of whatever they're afraid of. It gives them a feeling of hatred and anger. And that arises from this fear that they feel of they can't be around others, they can't trust other people. And I think we have to be careful when we look at fear. We have to realize that there's behind that fear is often an anger or a hatred. And when we're fearful, all these other emotions arise up that aren't good for us. The third poison is ignorance or confusion. And it doesn't mean ignorance like, ignorance of intellectual learning, book learning. It's ignorance in failing to see how all phenomena truly exist, or avidya is the Sanskrit word, and it just means non-seeing. And when you don't understand how all phenomena exist, how the material world exists, then fear arises, because now we're afraid of what's out there. Ravi Ravindra, in his book Science and the Sacred, says the important thing is not to see different things, but to see things differently. And that's really the goal of spiritual practice, is to learn to see things differently. It's easy to see things like everybody else sees them. But in the spiritual practice, we really have to learn to see things differently. How do things really exist? How do all phenomena exist? And that will allay our fears and help us to live a better life. We all know the story of Plato's Shadows on the Cave Wall, about the prisoners who were chained facing a wall, and all they could see were the shadows on the cave wall. And they couldn't believe that there was anything but shadows. That was reality to them. The cave wall with its shadow was the only thing they knew, until they were freed one day and they looked around and, oh my goodness, there's a whole different world out there. Again, they saw that, but they had to learn to see things differently to know that that wasn't reality. That was just mere shadows on the cave wall. So gaining a new perception of how phenomena exist will help us to understand what is reality. The world appears as a distinct, separate entity that we call reality. And obviously we live in this separation and duality, but that's just a delusion of the mind. And mind creates that delusion of separation and reality. We perceive a world out there and can't find a world in here. Or as Fred Alan Wolf, one of my favorite quantum physicists, said, there is no out there, out there. All is created in the mind by the mind. And that's something that at the Sangha that I studied at was really drilled into us, that all is created in the mind by the mind. And obviously Fred Alan Wolf agrees with that. We see people as separate. There's always a me in here and a you out there. And the one thing that the Eastern philosophies teach us is there's really no me in here and you out there. It just doesn't happen in reality because there is no out there, out there. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. Rather, as the creator and governor of the realm of matter. That's an interesting comment, because now we're talking about how mind creates matter. There is an interesting comment that I got out of Sri Aurobindo's book, The Life Divine. It's a big book, but it's very interesting. Took me a year to get through it, but it's one thing I learned about when he talked about mind and matter, or mind into matter, as Fred Alan Wolf did. Quantum physics or quantum mechanics has pretty much done away with the idea that there is a separate and distinct material universe. The idea that the universe is made up of objects whose existence is independent of human consciousness is in conflict with quantum mechanics or quantum physics. And they've proven this through experiments. The world is not independent of how we think. It's not independent of our observation of it. It indeed creates everything. The mind creates the world we see. There's a really good book, actually, and there's a video too. It's a TED Talk that Jill Bolte Taylor did, and she, based on her book, My Stroke of Insight. And it shows, she shows how her stroke, she woke up one morning and she knew she was having a stroke because she was a neurobiologist. She studied the brain. She woke up, she was having a stroke. And so she immediately got up and tried to go into the bathroom and get some water. She didn't know why she needed to get this water on her face. She thought that might help, but she could not feel the bathroom door. In fact, she saw her hand go through the bathroom door as if the door were transparent. She tried calling her colleague at work, and she couldn't dial the phone because she couldn't find the buttons. Her fingers would go through the buttons. That separation between the out there and the in here was gone. And so that's why we need, obviously, duality. We need to know that there is an out there, but that is not reality. And her book, My Stroke of Insight, is truly amazing. And it gives you a really good example of why and how our mind, she called it the brain. Obviously, her brain was having a stroke, but how the mind creates this separation that isn't really there. All phenomena is mere appearance to mind, created in the mind by the mind. Nothing has any inherent reality from its own side. And you notice it says inherent reality. So nothing exists on its own. It needs an observer. Everything needs an observer in order to exist. Quantum physicists have been working on this and have found that it's the observer that can affect the outcome. They say the only way that an observer can affect the outcome of an experiment is not to observe it, because by sheer observation, it can change the outcome. Often, it changes the outcome to meet the expectations of the observer. So what is reality? Well, Einstein said reality is merely an illusion, albeit a persistent one. In other words, everywhere we look, we're seeing illusion. And illusion, not in the way we think of illusion, which we'll talk about in a minute, but illusion in the way that things do not exist in the way we believe they do. Hans-Peter Dürr said, reality reveals itself primarily as nothing but potentiality. And in quantum physics, everything exists in potential or in potentia. And that means it's out there, it's waiting to be observed. And when it gets an observer, it then collapses the waves of potentiality into particles of actuality. We'll talk about that in a minute too, how that works. Reality leaves a lot to the imagination, John Lennon said. And our imagination does a lot to create the world that we experience as well. And as you can tell, we all have imaginations. Where would we be without imagination? If someone hadn't imagined computers, or if someone hadn't imagined the light bulb, where we would be. So reality leaves a lot to the imagination. Our thoughts can become reality. Our thoughts can become matter. Our thoughts can become a light bulb. Our thoughts can become a book. Our thoughts can become a new scientific wonder. And thoughts have a lot to do with it. And the author, Philip K. Dick, said, reality is an objectification of our prior thought formation, projected in a pseudo world. In other words, we objectify our thoughts. What we think becomes things. Thoughts are creative. Thoughts are creative. Thoughts are things. So when we're thinking, we are thinging. You can remember that. That's a good thing to remember. John Wheeler said, what we call reality consists of a few iron posts of observation between which we fill in by elaborate papier-mâché construction of imagination and theory. The observations of all participants, past, present, and future, join together to define what we call reality. The universe and the observer exist as a pair. A lot of times in theosophy classes, particularly Ravi Ravindra, in his classes that I've taken from him and in his books, he talks about Purusha and Prakriti. And so if you hear that term, those two words, Purusha and Prakriti, you can almost think of this as the universe and the observer. Purusha is what is the knower, and Prakriti is what can be known. So Purusha is the observer, and Prakriti is the universe. They kind of go together. It's a pair. Can anything exist without an observer? Well, the Eastern philosophies say no, and quantum physics says no. So the important and extremely difficult task of our time is to work on the construction of a new idea of reality. Wolfgang Pauli said that. And so we need to get a new idea of reality, because that way we know the difference between the real and the unreal. And what is really real? And is there a realer reality of which Most of the time, we're just not aware. So what about mind as a creator of matter? Wow, that's a big one. Does mind create matter? Well, first of all, I think it's good to look at that third point there. What is mind? I often get people that, well, what is mind? Just define mind. And there's still a lot of books you read, and they make mind and brain as the same thing. And I like to think of mind as the software and brain as the hardware that processes the information. Obviously, the brain is connected to all of the senses, and it helps us navigate the material world. But mind is the software, and mind is that thing that, and it's not really a thing, it's part of the heart chakra. It's not a physical structure, but it gives us our perceptions. The hardware that processes the information, for example, you look at a painting, you look at, say, a Picasso, for example, and some people love Picasso. They think it's great. And they look at the Picasso painting and they'll say, oh, that is the most beautiful painting I've ever seen. And we can agree, as a painting, yeah, we agree. I agree that it has colors and it has shapes and it's in a frame. But then the mind comes in and that person says, oh, that is a beautiful painting. Prettiest painting I ever saw. And I go, I don't think so. I think that is the ugliest painting I ever saw. And so my perception is different than your perception of a Picasso. And when we think of mind as not being a physical structure, it was interesting because Einstein's son gave his brain to science. And their goal was to look at his brain and see what it was in his brain that made him so smart. And they actually found out that there was nothing different in Einstein's physical brain that wasn't present in anybody's brain. And so when we look at mind is in this continual process of creating a conceptual world through thought and information of the senses. And we continue creating. It's always creating. It is never not creating. The three states of mind is often spoken of to help us kind of differentiate how we operate in the material universe. We have the gross waking consciousness, which is where we're all at right now. If you're listening to this webcast and you're thinking about things, you're taking in information to your senses, and you are aware of everything going on around you. Then you have your subtle mind, and our subtle mind is this consciousness on a subtler level. Subtle mind might even be daydreaming, where you're just not thinking about anything in particular, and maybe an idea pops up. Or maybe there's a lot of people that create it from the subtle mind. They get great ideas through the subtle mind. And then there's the very subtle mind, which is also a level of consciousness, but that endures after death. The Dalai Lama has a really good book called Sleeping, Dreaming, Dying. And he talks about these three states, that the awakening state is one state, but then you have the sleep state in which your subtle mind kind of falls into. And that's where you have a dream state. And then you often go into this very subtle state where you're not dreaming and you're completely oblivious to anything in the universe, including your own body. But it's our very subtle mind that endures after death. And that's one thing that we need to focus on, is how this subtle mind endures. What is the consciousness that we have continually, everywhere, all the time? We are always conscious. We are never not conscious. Another thing we need to remember is that matter is a manifestation of mind. There is no objective matter that exists if we're not there to observe it. It's not that all of this exists here on this level of consciousness, waiting for us to come here and look at it, like we might go to a store and look at the goods that are there, waiting for us to walk through the door and look at the stuff on the shelves. It is that we are creating every day, by our observation, everything that exists in the phenomenal world. So we don't come here and observe the phenomenal world. We actually create the phenomenal world. Matter is a manifestation of mind. In Buddhism, thinking that external objects populate our experience that exists independently from our consciousness is termed wrong view. You know, there's the Eight Noble Path, the Eightfold Noble Path, and it's termed wrong view, which is based in confusion and ignorance, as we talked about earlier. You know, the confusion and ignorance, which is the third poison. Ignorance of how things truly exist. Right view is the view that nothing exists inherently, that all is empty of inherent existence, and therefore there's nothing to grasp or become attached to. So it should make the practice of non-attachment pretty easy. If there's nothing to grasp onto, then why are we trying to grasp onto it and become attached to it? There's nothing to become attached to. So what is the external world like? Well, it's like a movie. Now, I don't know how many of you remember these old-fashioned projectors, but this is a picture of one that shows a film strip on a reel, and it has a light source, it has an energy source. And when the light and the energy move the film strip, it shows on the movie screen as a solid, real, movable movie. Frame by frame, we collapse the contents of matter, which is just light and energy. It's just waves of energy, into particles of matter. And the movie appears to be real. It looks like everything is just moving along together, when in actuality, that film strip is showing you frame by frame, nanosecond by nanosecond. And the illusion is, it appears to be all one thing, all one movie, people talking, people walking, action happening. But we don't realize that what we're seeing is just nanosecond by nanosecond. All phenomena arise and fall away, moment by moment. And we perceive this as ongoing reality, just like a movie, when things are just arising and falling away, moment by moment. We also perceive this reality as permanent and changeless, and so we become attached to it. This is what I see, this is what I want, so I become attached to it. And so we perceive this, but it's a wrong perception. Again, the Eightfold Noble Path, wrong perception. It's Maya, it's illusion, because nothing is real in the way we believe it is. People are often confused by this word illusion, and it took me a while to grab it. What is illusion? Well, illusion, it doesn't exist. No, everything exists. It just doesn't exist the way we believe it is. So what about a magician? You know, they call magicians illusionists. Why do they call them illusionists? Because what they are doing and what they are accomplishing with their magic tricks is an illusion. You are not seeing what's really happening. You are seeing what you think is happening. And I've been to a Siegfried and Roy show probably 20 years ago, maybe longer. It was before they got hurt. But I remember thinking, this can't be real. They can make these tigers disappear in an instant. And yet, I wasn't seeing what was really going on. I was seeing the illusion of what I thought was going on. These tigers were disappearing. So we have to think of illusion as, it's not that things aren't real. Things are real because obviously there's an observer. We're an observer. We see these things. And so they are real from our perspective. They're just not real in the way we think they are. There is a realer reality. So what about change and fear? None of us like change. I don't like change. And I've had plenty of change in my life. And you think you get used to change after a while, but you just never do. You know, it's like, you know, change is tough. So if you realize that all things change and there is nothing you will try to hold on to, if you are not afraid of dying, there is nothing you cannot achieve. So there's where this non-attachment comes in. You can't even get attached to the way things are, because I will guarantee you tomorrow they will change. And if you're not afraid of dying, then living becomes extremely beneficial. It becomes extremely good. You can live well. You can live the life you want to if you're not afraid of dying. All fear is rooted in the fear of loss. And if you believe nothing is permanent, you will never fear its loss. And I think that's really difficult for us to remember, because it's almost like we don't even overtly think, oh, well, I like this and it's permanent. We know it's not permanent. We know that trees die, books crumble to dust, which I'm sorry to see that. I have a lot of books. And I always think, well, books are permanent. Well, they're only permanent if I read them and put them in my mind. Maybe then they'll be permanent. But if you believe nothing is permanent, you will never fear its loss. And I think that's really important. There was an interesting story. There was a newscast. There was a fire up in Sedona, and it ran through this subdivision. And it got only one house in this subdivision, and it burned this one house down. And so the news reporter went up to Sedona, and they stuck a microphone in this guy's face, and they said, your house was the only house that burned down in this whole subdivision. How do you feel about that? And he looked at the reporter and he said something that I'm sure just really shocked the reporter. He said, I feel strangely free. and so he wasn't really mourning the loss. He was embracing it. He was accepting of it, because in truth, his house wasn't permanent and change happens. And I thought that was interesting, that I'm sure maybe the reporter learned a lesson too. I hope they did anyway. So is there a realer reality? Well, both science and yoga proceed from the assumption that reality revealed by our ordinary senses is not quite what in truth is real. It is not the real reality. I can remember shortly before Brent died, I had been outside. It was a beautiful April day. And when I went back in the house, I was telling Brent how beautiful it was outside and how beautiful the plants were, and everything seemed so green and the sky was beautiful. And I asked him, I said, is this reality or is there another reality? Because he'd kind of been going in and out of reality, not really knowing where he was. In fact, one time I was sitting here in my office and he called to me, and I went out in the family room where we had the hospital bed, and I said yes. And he goes, am I dead yet? And I said, no, not yet. I said, if you have to ask me if you are dead, you are probably not dead. And so he kind of smiled. And he said, this world is not real. Or he said, this is not real. Over there. And he kind of pointed out into space. He said, over there, it's realer, a realer reality over there, as if he wasn't quite sure. And yet he knew he was experiencing a realer reality that was kind of outside of this material reality that he was still kind of experiencing, but not sure about. So what is death? Well, they used to say this all the time at the Buddhist center that I attended for a few years. Death is certain, the time of our death is uncertain. And we were always encouraged to remember that, because it's the uncertainty. It's the uncertainty that creates fear of losing our bodies, which we identify so deeply with. We're so attached to our bodies. Death of the body merely allows the continuation of the mind in limitless experience, unimpeded by the body. The body is really an obstacle when you look at it. And it's a great thing. It allows us to do a lot of things. But in many ways, our bodies are limiting in our, especially in our spiritual path. So living in equanimity, even-mindedness, no attachment, no aversion, helps us to be prepared for whatever comes in our life, including death. Today is a good day to die. I think everybody remembers that from the movie Little Big Man. And it's actually a Sioux battle cry, meaning I am ready for whatever comes. We should always be prepared to die and have no regrets. We should embrace what is. It's all a part of the adventure of life. And it was so amazing to me that Brent, although he had no specific spiritual or religious tradition or ideas, that he called his cancer diagnosis an adventure. It's all a part of the adventure of life, and it helps us not to suffer. Brent said toward the end, he said, please, if somebody asked if I suffer, tell them, no, I didn't suffer. I never wanted life to be different than it is. And he had no regrets. He chose not to suffer. And so how do we transcend suffering? Again, it's learning to live in equanimity, to embrace all as the path. This equanimity thing, no aversion, no attachment, even no preferences. I started practicing this idea of no preferences, and it was amazing how easy life got. Where do you want to go to eat? Well, I don't care. I have no preferences. What do you want to eat? I have no preferences. And it's like I just started doing this, and it's all of a sudden life became so easy. No preferences. And also, if you want something specific and you can't get it or it doesn't happen, then, oh my goodness, now you're disappointed. And so learning to embrace all of that is very beneficial. The middle way. Suffering is alleviated when we cease wanting life to be different than it is. And boy, that's a biggie, because all of us go through periods of time when we want life to be different than it is. We cannot choose whether to experience physical pain. Physical pain is a reality, but we can choose not to suffer. That was a big lesson that Brent taught me. He really didn't suffer. He had a great 18 months, and he taught a lot of people a lot of things. And he had a very good sense of humor about his path. In fact, one day he was at his desk. He was laughing and talking with this client on the phone. And when he was done, his colleague came over and she asked him, "How can you be so happy knowing you're going to die in a few months?" And he said, "Well, Jenny, he said, I'm really luckier than most people. Most people don't know when they're going to die or what they're going to die of. But," he said, "I know about when I'm going to die, and I also know what I'm going to die from." He said, "I'm pretty lucky. The rest of you have to live in the mystery." And it gave her such a relief. He said that she just smiled and it made her feel so good. And so how we die is important. Resistance is futile. We will die. And he accepted the fact that his life was coming to an end sooner than he thought, but he embraced the path and rejected any semblance of suffering. Sri Aurobindo in The Life Divine says, "The will in the universal force that held the form together now withdraws from constitution and supports instead a process of dispersion. Not until then is there the real death of the body." The dying process is important. How we die isn't so important, other than we need to die well. How we live is important, and that's why it's important to know how to live. It's important to know what life is and what death is and the illusions that surround all of that. And we have to die consciously. A conscious death is good. We die consciously and dying without fear, knowing that it was a life well lived. Dying consciously and embracing the dying process. Not everyone gets to die with a slow process, as described in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and all those processes that come with it. Brent did, and I had my Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and I was so glad that I knew the process of dying. And I even told him, I said, "I'm glad you're dying by the book. That way I know what's going on." And I think that's important for people to know what's going on. The dying process is sometimes a bit difficult, but it's good to know. And I recommend studying that. Dying consciously and embracing that process, even for the person who's with the dying person, needs to know how to embrace that process. Dying with no regrets, dying with no attachments. Seneca said, "Before I became old, I took care to live well. In old age, I take care to die well." And dying well means dying willingly. In other words, not being so attached to the body that you want someone to save you, pull out all the stops, or save my loved one, whatever it takes, just save them. Dying well means dying willingly, because we all know it's going to happen. It's part of life. Death is part of life. And to die well means dying willingly. I think that's good to remember. I'll close with the headstone of my parents. My mother didn't want to live to be 100, and as you can see, she made it. She died the day after her 97th birthday, and I think she died willingly. She was one of those people that lived well, and I think she died well also. And one thing to leave you with as I close is something that Brent told me just before he died. He said, "Dying is easy. I thought it would be harder than this, but it's so easy." That has stuck with me, and I try to remember that every day. Remember death. Remember death. And remember that dying is easy. It's living that's hard. And that's why we study the illusion of life and death. No surprises.